Hello, fellow parents and educators. Thank you for joining me at Education Evolution, where we are disrupting the status quo in today's learning models. We talk about present-day education, what's broken, who's fixing it, and how. I'm Dr. Maureen O'Shaughnessy, your host and founder of Education Evolution and the Microschool Coalition, where we are fiercely committed to changing the narrative, to reimagining the education landscape and creating learning that serves all children and prepares them to thrive. If you are new, welcome to the podcast. Please subscribe on our website to get it delivered to your inbox weekly. If you've been around a while, have you left a review? Welcome, Scottie. So glad you're here today.
Well, thank you for having me, Maureen. I'm excited to be here.
Yay! Hello, Education Evolution listeners. Dr. Scotland Nash is joining us today. Scottie is an award-winning educational activist with a mile-long list of awards and accomplishments. Check out the show notes to see this impressive list. I know her in her current role as the Director of Education for the ADL Pacific Northwest region. Here she works with schools, including mine, districts, and their community to learn about identity and diversity, to practice anti-bias strategies for communication, and act as allies for social justice. Just what our world needs now. Scottie.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it's like, I feel like, wow, that's like, ta-da. Let's start with anti-bias education. What does it look like and how does it connect to meaningful and important conversations about race?
Yeah, that is such a really important question right now. We're hearing so much about building anti-racist schools and anti-racist systems. And I think we need to work towards that. And I think it's super important to make sure that we are thinking about the BIPOC community and how they have just been so marginalized and disenfranchised for so long. And the role of anti-bias education is a little bit different. So when I look at anti-bias education, I look at it as like an entry point for conversation, right? So we need to understand who we are. So when you started that framing, you talked about identity and difference, and we talk a lot about that. Like you can't dive deep into anti-bias work or anti-racist work if we aren't reflective about who we are as individuals. And then that really helps us understand and connect to people who are different from us. And I think about that in terms of building empathy and how important that empathy and compassion are. The next piece about the anti-bias education is really understanding that everyone has biases. They may be implicit, they may be explicit, but that we all have them. And so how do we understand them and interrupt them when we have them, but also support others in interrupting their own biases that may show up as prejudice. And I really look at this anti-bias work as so critical as a foundation into building anti-racist schools and systems. And so without the ability to have that conversation and that reflection, how do we take those next steps to look at systems and policies and hiring practices and everything that's so essential in making anti-racist schools, for instance, looking at the curriculum. And in our curriculum, I think of our next step in terms of taking action or championing change in that piece of let's shift our curriculum so that our history curriculum, our language arts curriculum, our science and math curriculum include windows and mirrors for students to see themselves, to see people who are different than them, and to hear those stories and the role of storytelling and connection and building empathy.
I love that. I love the windows and mirrors line. That just creates imagery. So the whole idea of interrupting bias, can you give me an example of maybe how you've done that in your own life or with somebody, just to kind of make it really specific?
Sure. Sometimes when I think about interrupting bias, first I think about your own bias. And I explain it oftentimes as if you're walking somewhere, you're having an experience somewhere, and you feel kind of something in your gut. it's kind of checking your gut and saying, why am I feeling this and responding this way or that way? And would I respond differently if it was a different experience? So very specifically about a self-check, for instance, is, I'm about 5'3", I'm walking in a parking lot and I see someone, it's 4:30, 5 o'clock at night in Seattle. We know it's getting kind of dark. If someone's walking towards me, how am I responding to that person and for what reasons? Is that person black or white? Is that person dressed in fine clothing or baggy clothing? Is that person bigger than me? Is that person smaller than me? But why am I responding or feeling the way that I'm feeling? And do I think that response might be different based on, for instance, the color of the person's skin? So those are some kind of internal checks you might do. Yeah. But I also think about if you hear it. So if you hear somebody say something that to you sounds biased, I kind of think of a 3-step rule and saying, hey, did I just hear this right? Can you tell me more about it? And then have you thought about? So it's like a very clear 3-step process to interrupt and just call attention to. And it's not to be aggressive. It's to check for understanding and to help reframe and understand what you heard. And so it helps you think about the intention may not have been there, but the impact was there. And how do you begin to stop that impact? Because we don't want lots of negative impact.
I love that 3-step process. My 23-year-old protests on Cap Hill is on top of everything. And she'll catch me saying something in ignorance, like, oh, there's a gypsy journal class. Mom, gypsy is a derogatory term against the Roma. It's like, oh, golly, that was what I was for Halloween as a child. I thought it was really elegant and cool. Thanks, Gianna. So your 3-step process, I think, is a really gentle way to help us because, oh my gosh, I make a lot of mistakes and I want that feedback. And this is a really nice way for somebody to give that's respectful, but also interrupting behaviors that are no longer acceptable.
Right? It just kind of causes that pause and reflection point because so oftentimes we might be well-intentioned. So for so long, like I know I grew up saying, I don't see color. And we know that when someone else says that now, or when you hear that being said, that you're automatically invalidating a whole piece of a person's identity right there. And so the intention 30 years ago was good. The impact was not. And so by saying, did I hear you say you didn't notice what that person looks like? Because I see that person as a Black, female, strong, thoughtful person. Can we talk about that a little bit more? Because it's a shift and a growing and an evolution in the process of understanding our own biases and the impact of them.
Yes. And we know we want to speak up. We want to be a part of the change. And this is a really nice way to be invitational, but also to not just like brush it under the carpet, which has been a problem for far too long.
And I also think it's a good self-frame. Like, did I just say that? Because let's be honest, like I've been introspective and thinking about this for a long time and I still make mistakes and I still put my foot in my mouth. And how do I know if I'm being an ally unless I'm checking in with people who I'm acting as an ally towards, right? And the reality is ally isn't a noun, it's a verb, right? It's this idea of allyship. How do you show up with people? And it's not about how you're showing it's about how you're showing up, but it's also about, are you showing up in a way that's needed by whomever you're trying to show that allyship towards? And so I think about this idea of self-check too, and building relationships with people that are, through the window, people who might be different than you, so that you can have those checks too. And having those people like, hey, did I say that right? Or am I understanding? Or I was thinking. So building that frame, not just when you're talking to others, but when you're thinking about yourself and checking in with people who might be different from you.
I completely agree. I think that's a really great strategy. And it makes me wonder, our students work on habits of success, and they pick out one for each quarter and reflect it on and put it on their report cards. And it's the end of the quarter. So they're working on that. And we work on soft skills like empathy and vulnerability and growth mindset. So thinking about this self-check, thinking about this awareness, how do you see some of these skills like empathy, vulnerability, growth mindset? How do you see them playing out for our teachers and in our own personal practices?
Totally. I think that in education, it's so important to not assume, right? So we need to not assume that kids are building these skills at home, because did we learn them all at home? And it's a partnership. And so how are we fostering these skills with our students? How are we fostering these skills with ourselves? And how are we supporting families so that we can all be speaking that same language? Empathy is, I've heard empathy described as walking in someone else's shoes. And I think I think back to Brene Brown and some of the things I hear her talking about in terms of vulnerability and empathy. And I like how I hear it from her, if I'm getting it right or not. But what I take away is the idea that it's not walking in someone else's shoes. It's being able to see the shoes that that person is walking in and walking alongside them and doing it in a thoughtful way. And because I can't ever have the experience of a Black woman. I can't ever have the experience of an Asian woman. I can't ever have the experience of a Muslim man. However, I have had experiences that have helped develop me in building my empathy and where I've been able to lean into my vulnerability and remembering those as I'm walking alongside with someone and trying to support what they're feeling. And that is a skill that I think we need to build in classroom time and regular conversational time and practice, and even be a little bit meta about it. So if you're having that moment in a classroom as a teacher, calling it out. If you're having that moment with a colleague, pausing and say, hey, this is what I'm feeling right now, and really connecting around, have you had that experience? Because like this just happened in my classroom. Can we talk about it a little bit? This is how I'm feeling. We don't like to talk about feelings very much. And then I think about in the classroom with students, making it routine so that they're comfortable, so that students are comfortable letting on, like, I read this story and this is how I felt. This is how I connected to it. And consistently building those opportunities in a classroom for students is going to be really important.
Absolutely. That practice and putting it into classrooms, it makes me think about systemic change. And did you know you and I both graduated from Seattle U's Ed Doc program?
I did not know that you did as well. You know, I have to say one of the things I loved about that program was, I don't know what year you graduated, but when I was there, it wasn't all educators. It
Mine either.
Right?
RNs. There weren't that many K-12. It was RNs and all kinds of some college, so all different kinds. And it was so rich, but it also really focused on collaboration. We got to take tests together. It focused on diversity, transformational leadership, and systemic change. And Margaret Wheatley's work back in the day. You know, so system change. How would you apply that to this? I mean, what do we need right now? This is what we have is not getting us where we need to go. What would you recommend?
You know, that's such a good question. And I told you, I think when we first started talking, like I would drive by and see signs for lead prep and then I'd, forget, then I'd remember and I'd go home and I'd look it up. But connecting with you made me really connect to your story and, look you up a little bit and dive in a little bit. And it brings me back to when I started as an educator in terms of systems change and realizing that part of systems change is acknowledging that there's not one system that's going to work for every kid.
Yes.
And so we can't apply one model to every space and place and think that it's going to be totally effective. There might be strands of things that we know to be true that are necessary for every child, and how they're exposed to that might need to be a little bit different. So I wish I could say like, yeah, let's go into all of these really big public high schools and disrupt them and make this happen for every kid. But you know what? Those big public high schools are really successful for some kids. So I think looking at not that whole system, but looking at, we have history, we have English, we have math, we have science, but what we need to have in all of it is, and in any class and in any teacher education program, I think perhaps maybe the systems change is thinking about how do we help teachers embed anti-bias social emotional learning in all curriculum. So whether you're in a large school or a micro school or a charter school or a independent school, it's how do we help people get comfortable with that conversation? That's
Absolutely.
The systems change I think about.
Oh my gosh. I think you nailed that. And I know I was an elementary major and elementary psychology, Spanish combination thing, but my friends that were secondary ed majors had like one education class and everything else was their major subject. So they never got to go into depth on this aspect of curriculum. It was like one class on how to teach your subject and everything else was your subject.
Right. So one thing I do in some of my trainings, which I've really gotten comfortable with, is we have different experiences in the ADL, different protocols that we use around understanding your own identity. So the identity molecule or the power flower or, you know, these different kinds of experiences in terms of unpacking who you are and what is your relationship about different aspects of your identity to kind of the larger picture in society, for instance, right? So who has the power dynamic in what space and place? So as a white woman, I may own power because I'm white, but I own less power as a woman than if I were a man, right? So you're kind of reflecting on that power dynamic for yourself. So what I talk to history and English teachers about, and even science people about, science teachers about, is the idea like, how do you use that same protocol in your classroom to unpack a historical figure or the story of somebody in a novel? So this idea that if you are unpacking history, like, and you're going back, and the voting rights piece has been huge, right? And the new monument that was just put up in Central Park in New York, and to have Sojourner Truth sitting there with Elizabeth Cady Stanton is so, and one other woman who you might remember, I'm totally blanking. My history background is killing me right now that I can't remember, but it's 3 women, 2 white women and Sojourner Truth, and what each of their impact was in voting rights for women. And both of those 2 white women were pretty racist, right? And so looking at and unpacking kind of the power flower for each of those people and understanding their dynamic starts to bring in a conversation about building empathy and looking at character and talking about understanding bias as it's been in history within the context of what you already may be doing in your curriculum.
I like how that frames it. And I also like that unpacks the human aspect and the era and the culture. It's not just the story characters and, you know, literary themes. It's going to such a level. It's embedding empathy in all of the subject areas.
And looking at it too, it maybe trends over time, right? So if you're reading from House on Mango Street the same year that you're reading To Kill a Mockingbird, the same year that you're reading, Scarlet Letter, to, you know, whatever the book may be, and I'm pulling out some traditional examples. I think we've got a lot more going on now, but looking at the 2 main characters in each of those, you know, stories, each of those books, and looking at, are there trends across time we can notice? Are there around gender, around race, around class, around all these different aspects? What's remained constant? What's changed? And looking at it not just from the perspective of the characters in the book, but maybe even the authors. Who's telling the story, you know? And so I think that there are so many ways where if we get comfortable unpacking our own identities, unpacking the identities of the people that we're reading about, and then how do we connect to them? And what are trends over time? Start to build that story, I think, in a much more impactful way. And if all of the stories you're telling are of white people, you need to pause and ask yourself a really big question. right? Because that's not okay. For so many reasons, it's not okay.
Yes.
But it's just, I think, lots of different ways to connect around that.
I agree completely. I know you do a lot of work coaching school leaders. So is there a common message around this theme that you share with school leaders when you're coaching them?
Great question. When I talk to school leaders, I really think about what work are they doing as leaders? So how are they reflecting on themselves? What are they reading? What are they watching? What are they doing? And then I think about, what are you sharing? So what are you sharing? Not just about yourself, but what about your learning? So how are you sharing that with your staff? And then that comes out through both a coaching lens, where the principal is coaching and working with a teacher. So like, a principal's primary purpose is as an instructional leader. And so helping that principal reflect on their own instructional practices, their own understanding about anti-bias, anti-racist instruction, and how are you fostering that same skill set and building that in your teachers, but also through like the broader professional development. And are you modeling what you're hoping teachers are doing in a classroom? So if you're hoping your teachers are starting with anti-bias, social emotional learning kind of curriculum in their classroom, are you starting your professional development the same way? So for instance, are you using relationship building questions to open up meetings that you have? Are you making it a space where teachers are beginning to say, when did you realize your race? And having small groups at the beginning of your professional development. So I look at it in those ways. So when I am coaching or working with instructional leaders, the questions I raise is, what are you doing for yourself? What are you doing when you're coaching teachers? And what are you doing in your professional development? And getting at your common why, right? Going back to Simon Sinek. What is your why? Well, if your why is to meet the needs of each and every kid, then we have to be thinking about anti-bias, social emotional learning.
Absolutely. Oh, that makes perfect sense. And it has to be at all of those levels. It's who we are as instructional leaders. And so it has to be personal. It has to be what we're modeling and what we're leading with in our professional development. It has to be that holistic approach that makes wonderful sense.
Right. And not assuming that just because you as an instructional leader or principal has perhaps done X, Y, and Z, it doesn't mean your staff has. And if some of your staff has, maybe not all of your staff has. So how do you also encourage them to work together in what I call high functioning professional learning communities, where they can be vulnerable with their work and vulnerable with their data, and build those relationships with each other so that they're teaching and learning together? Because the principal can't be the only teacher. And every building has a lot of expertise. We have a lot of smart, thoughtful, intentional teachers out there. So right? How do we capitalize on their knowledge? And not only that, we might have teachers in our buildings who are more knowledgeable about something than you, the leader, are. So how do you lean into them and elevate and distribute their learning among your staff too?
Absolutely. I know that's definitely the case in my building. We have wonderful teachers that I get to learn from, and a shared leadership team so that I get to benefit from their smarts and we get to benefit from the synergy. And it's pretty important that we're all in it together and that we feel like a sense of community.
Yeah. And if all of us hold our why is the students. Our why is to help grow great people. Well, what do we know about making great people? We know they need empathy. We know they need a vulnerability. We know they need a depth of understanding. They need to understand themselves. They need to understand people who are different from them. And then we need to take it so far as to say, now that we know what we know, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do with it? Right? So we can't just sit there and say, teach these things, but now that we know these things, how do we move forward with them is such a big thing too.
I completely agree. I am on a mission that we focus on love and belonging, and that students have passion and purpose and a way to express that in their learning. And that it's not, right now, it sometimes feels like it's all about the academics and content. And I really feel like it has to be about basic human needs. And then kids will be more receptive to applying the content in ways that are relevant to them if they have the opportunity. So I think we have a lot of work to do to really integrate the two and not have it so content driven at the risk of being lacking that humanity aspect.
Totally, because the reality is there are a lot of ways we can get that content now. We don't need to know it all, and we're never going to know it all. I remember talking, like when I work with history teachers the last handful of years in particular, I'm like, there is no way that you can teach all of history. You just can't. And there's new history that was made yesterday. There's new history that was made this morning. So you can't ever do it all. So we need to teach kids to learn how to think about the history, which is what you're talking about, like the belonging, the connection, the love, the empathy, those pieces, so that when they're looking at the history and learning from it, that they can make meaning of it, and then they can help to impact the change they want it to be.
Yes. Complete agreement.
Yeah.
Final question. If you had a magic wand, Scottie, and you could transform the educational experience of our youth, you could do anything that would make an impact on our young, what would you wish for?
That's a really good question. I can't get over the fact that when I think about the systems conversation you and I had a few minutes ago, and I know that the large system works for some kids, I just can't help but be reminded that education in the 21st century doesn't look much different than when it was started a couple hundred years ago.
Yes.
And so when I think about what is my one wish, it's that we could really think about meeting the needs of every kid. And if we're working in a system, broadly speaking, we have exceptions to the rule, and even large public schools that follow the traditional structure, there may be exceptions to the rule. So this isn't to, put any one place or thing down. But I think my wish is that we would really start to think about how to put each and every student at the center, so that we could give them the options to experience what the purpose of education is, and not what the purpose of the school system was when it was created a couple hundred years ago in a white, rich, male-centered agrarian way. And so I just think, let's think about our kids now and where we want them to be. And that's, I think, I don't know what that looks like exactly, but my wish is that we could do that.
I'm speechless. Yes, please.
Right. We'll find it. We'll make it happen.
Yeah. I'm finding more and more people saying that same thing. And I think we're building toward a tipping point, and you're definitely a part of that.
Well, and remembering change takes time. It's a slow process. And if it could happen overnight, then it would have been done already. But it's slow and it's purposeful. And I think we need to do whatever we can to celebrate the stories and the successes of people who are doing that, who are putting the kids at the center and thinking about, this is what we have. How do we meet our kids' needs? And this is where we want to be, and how do we get there? And I think we need to do more of that, celebrating the bright spots. Not for my own language, but the language of others, right?
Yep. And that's truly the purpose of this podcast, is guys, we need to make some changes and check out what these cool people are doing to be a part of this, because there is a lot to celebrate and it does take time. And so we just have to doggedly take baby steps forward. That's all we can do.
Yeah. And, the work at the ADL, for instance, we talk about systemic change, school climate. Start by thinking about your school climate, building a school climate that is no place for hate. Definitely worthwhile. How do the kids commit to that, right? Thinking about these trainings around identity and difference and bias and social action. Who doesn't want to think about that? So, and, we're doing the work and we believe in the work, and I know others are doing the work. And so how do we've got to keep the momentum going.
Absolutely. I'm inspired. Thank you, Scottie, for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It was so much fun.
Whew. Take a breath, Maureen. Scottie's message on empathy and anti-bias is so timely and important. Our BIPOC brothers and sisters have been disenfranchised for so long. Becoming anti-racist and promoting anti-bias schools and communities takes empathy and a willingness to look inside with understanding and catch and interrupt our own bias. We need to listen to ourselves and then others and question and lovingly challenge to weed out this bias. I'm thinking that starting with myself, if I can become very intentional on catching and interrupting bias in and around me, I can be a pebble dropped in the pond. Then, if each of you do the same, our ripples can overlap. Slowly, we can live anti-bias lives and impact institutions and policies until we've made empathy the norm and our BIPOC community, our LGBTQ community, our special needs community, anyone disenfranchised is embraced and treated with the love and respect deserved. The golden rule to love and do unto others is foundational in all major world religions. We believe in loving each other. Now it's time to do it. If you're finding yourself thinking, I need to do this in my school, let's talk about it. I consult with schools to help them find new, innovative solutions to reaching every student. Let's put together an action plan. Visit educationevolution.org/consult to book a call and let's get started. Education Evolution listeners, you are the ones to ensure we create classrooms where each student is seen, heard, valued, and thriving. We need you. Let's go out and reach every student today. I'd be so grateful if you'd head over to your podcast app to give a great rating and review if you found this episode valuable. Don't wait. Please do it right now before you forget. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening. Signing off, I am Maureen O'Shaughnessy, your partner in boldly reimagining education.